All right, it looks like it's 11 a.m., so we will go ahead and kick things off. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura McIntyre, Content Marketing Manager at Unify Labs. On behalf of the entire Unify team, thanks for joining us today. For this episode of Industry Insights, we are thrilled to have Adam Murray from CannonDesign joining us to share his experience managing a Revit library in a multidisciplinary nationwide firm. Managing BIM content in a multidisciplinary firm can be challenging. Part of the BIM manager's role in this type of organization is to maintain standards, administer content libraries, and ensure quality content is easy to find. We are excited for the opportunity to learn firsthand how Adam successfully executes his role as a BIM manager and conquers the roadblocks he encounters along the way. I highly encourage you to take advantage of the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation to ask any questions you may have or to write a comment you'd like to share. If you are currently viewing this webinar in full screen mode, please hover over the bottom of your screen and a toolbar will pop up for you to submit a question. At the end of the presentation, we will get to these questions, but I welcome you to ask them throughout the webinar as they come to mind. Without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to our host, Unify's BIM specialist, Jay Merlon, to get things started. Jay, take it away.
All right, thanks, Laura. So as Laura mentioned, we're really excited to have Adam Murray on the line here as the BIM manager for CannonDesign. So Adam, first of all, welcome. It's great to have you. So you've been with Cannon for nearly 6 years and have risen through the ranks to your current role as BIM manager. Can you just tell us a little bit about your professional experience, how you got started in the industry, and how you ended up at your current role at Cannon?
Hi, Jay. Thanks for having me. I've been working professionally, mostly in the architectural industry for about 8 years now. Obviously studied in college, trained, and became a registered architect earlier this year. So that was kind of on track for the first 6 years or so of my professional career. I worked for an oil and gas company, working on facilities for them. I've done a lot of medical campus planning and design work. Worked on several higher education projects with research lab components. And throughout that entire process, I really had a knack not only for the design and kind of technical aspects of architecture, but also just a big passion for technology. And so for about for the last 2 years, I was working in the capacity of a BIM manager for FKP. And then when we merged with CannonDesign about a year ago, I was able to also become a BIM manager for them.
Well, that sounds great. So that's interesting that you are a licensed architect, but you chose the technology side of the industry to gravitate to.
Yeah, as one of my leaders always likes to say, architecture is my first love, and then I really just kind of drove myself toward technology as well. So I find interesting ways to kind of marry those two together because they don't always get along very well.
Right. Well, it sounds like you're sort of a missing link here in our industry, so that's awesome. So can you tell us about a little more detail about your role at Cannon? So as a BIM manager, what sorts of responsibilities do you have?
Sure. I'm one of a few BIM managers at the firm, but some of my primary responsibilities are just providing oversight to our varied project teams across the different markets that we work in to help support them to deliver work. That's obviously the primary driver for architecture and design firms out there. So we're just trying to make sure that those teams can deliver a project as efficiently as they can, from conception to building a model to what I think the industry is seeing more of, where we're handing that model over to a client or owner at the end of a project as well.
Right. So at CannonDesign, you have quite a number of offices. It's also a multidisciplinary firm. Can you tell us more about CannonDesign, what you specialize in, and even what it's like to work there?
Sure. Yeah. CannonDesign's a big company, just over 1,000 people, I think, and roughly 19 offices right now across the world. They focus not only in architecture, but they have full engineering capabilities, so mechanical, electrical, plumbing, telecom, and even structural. And we also have in-house construction services as well. Some of the markets that we work in are, some of the things that I have history in, like healthcare, science and technology, education, and corporate commercial are some of the big ones. And it's been great to work here. Like I said, my former firm FKP kind of merged with CannonDesign about a year ago, so it's been really fun to be part of a new team, and also challenging, kind of learning new standards, new ways of thinking, new approaches to some of the problems that we see every day.
So with I believe you said 19 offices worldwide, how many of those offices were added with the merge? Or you were with FKP originally. I'm just curious, how big was FKP before the merge, and how big are, and does the 19 offices include the CannonDesign offices?
Yeah, it does. So 19 would be the total Canon count. FKP was 3 offices in Houston, Dallas, and Columbus, Ohio before the merger.
Oh, wow. Okay. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about, so we've talked about some background on yourself and the company. So let's talk about how the teams are structured at CannonDesign. So as a BIM manager, are you overseeing a specific discipline or a team of BIM specialists, or is it more of a regional type of role?
We split it up regionally for the most part. So out of the 4 BIM managers we have, we're kind of spread out across the U.S., which is pretty nice, and kind of convenient to set it up in a regional style. So I'm down in Houston, so I oversee our Houston, Dallas, and Denver offices directly. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be supporting other project teams throughout the company, because we also look obviously for an expertise in a certain area of our practice. So if one of our other BIM managers knows more about something else, obviously they're going to be helping to support that team, regardless if it's in one of their predefined office locations.
Okay, and so you had mentioned 4 regional BIM managers. Now, I know it can be challenging to implement, let's say, like new standards or adopt new software, or make changes at a national level. So does your firm have like a technology or BIM specific steering committee? Probably the BIM managers are part of this, the steering effort, but I'm just curious if there's another kind of tier of committees or teams that have to approve things like software purchases and standards.
Yeah, there's a kind of a collection of folks that are involved in a lot of that, and it does depend on whether it's standards implementation or technology. Primarily, if it's technology based, we can work kind of amongst ourselves if it's related to BIM, and obviously with our direct leadership to figure that out. But for standards, it's a little more broad, just because we are multidisciplinary. So obviously, there's a lot of vetting and discussion that needs to happen with the related discipline leads for whatever the workflow or standard may be, and also working with our quality team. Those are the folks that we work with a lot when we review standards and kind of implementation of those, because it's not just about the technical how, but it's also the why and the outcome and how it looks and how it's communicated to contractors and trade partners.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you for that. And now that we've got background on how the teams are structured, let's actually get into the subject at hand for this webinar, which is specifics on how FKP CannonDesign approaches library organization and content. So particularly because you're a multi-office, multi-discipline firm, I know that you can lose control of organization and libraries without proper management. So can you tell us about some of the challenges associated with managing BIM content across those multiple offices and those multiple disciplines?
I can, Jay. And I think and that's part of the nature of being in such a large company and with so many disciplines, that there's a lot of varied needs of content throughout the firm. So in my past experience at FKP, where we were only architecture, it was a little easier to tailor content and workflows to that deliverable. But obviously with engineering leads and construction, there's a lot more at play there. And we want to make sure that we do as an efficient job as possible. With those added disciplines also comes the danger of death by committee. When we're meeting with all these groups and trying to propose new standards or a workflow, we try and limit, we don't want 30 people making that decision, because then nothing will get done. So that's always one of the challenges, that we really need to figure out who are the key players and who are those people that we need to go talk to about a change or an addition to something. Another challenge is just the different project types that we work on, and the different delivery methods in how we might, hand over a project to a contractor or to an owner. Project by project, regardless of any standard you have, there's probably going to be something that doesn't agree with the last project you did. So trying to accommodate for those project-specific changes while also maintaining a company standard can be challenging sometimes. And then, with the number of offices that we have, I have a bullet on my little list here that just says AWOL, because sometimes you just have people and teams that do what they want. And so it's a little hard to manage content that way. But I think as a BIM manager team, we do a pretty good job of, educating folks and, really listening to their concerns to help make sure, like, whatever the company standard is, that it works.
Right. And so being at a firm, a larger firm, multi-office again, how have you specifically at FKP Canon decided to group content into libraries? Like, what does your actual library structure look like, as far as, like, is it organized by discipline, or are there separate libraries for sub-disciplines? Is there, like, metadata that you're using for tagging within your content management system?
Good question. Yeah, so we organize the content primarily by discipline, just because that seems to be an easy way to not only control permission of content, but also just a fluent way for people to understand where they need to go to find something. Because we oftentimes think about components of a building in those terms. At least in my experience, that's been the way people think about, a toilet is plumbing, so I'm going to go to plumbing to find that piece of content. And then, we do layer metadata on top of all of that. So, searchable tags. So if you're not quite sure what you're looking for, you can at least get to a collection of content that might be what you're trying to find.
Right.
In addition to those discipline folders, we also just keep like a general Sandbox library, because I won't be the first to acknowledge that any company standard content is not always the best. So when teams or individuals find content from another source, or even if they modify a company standard family and use it in a project, we always want to do our best to make sure we track those changes back to the company content, or if it wasn't part of that originally, we want to vet that and see if it's something that we can fit into the company standards.
Right. So you mentioned a sandbox library. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about how you would define a sandbox library, and maybe what the actual workflow is like to get content into the sandbox and test and all of that?
Sure. Yeah. So our Sandbox library is like a playground essentially. We have it open permissions for people to write content to that location, and also pull content from it if they just can't find anything in what I would call like the company approved stuff. But there's a family they think might work in the Sandbox. By all means, go ahead and try it out. So that's kind of how we use it currently. And it seems to be working out pretty well, because that gives people, again, a place to put something in a location that's on the radar of all of our BIM managers and discipline leads, to be able to vet that content. Because a lot of times we'll get people that have that family and they're just not quite sure how to share it with other people. So a lot of times you'll see content getting loaded into a project, and that's where it lives and dies until that same person goes on to another project and they just end up copying it from project to project to project. And a lot of times when that happens, it comes with all sorts of garbage that was loaded in from the previous project and parameters that don't make sense or don't comply with standards anymore.
Right, absolutely. I think that is a great workflow to just sort of open up this library for your users so that you can more or less track content with your management system, rather than the local, sharing locally, or like you said, transferring between projects. So for library, you sort of touched on permissions and control with libraries. So who has permissions to modify libraries, like Sandbox aside, right? Because that's more or less open, it sounds like. But let's say your discipline, your vetted content, who has control over those libraries? Is it like the BIM managers only, or do you have a team of BIM specialists?
It's so over the company content, that's usually controlled by the BIM managers and also the discipline leads for our engineers. And we include them because I'm not going to be the one to make a call on if their content works for them. You know, I'm not an engineer by trade, and so I don't have as much experience as they do with that kind of content, and I'm not going to assume that I know what they need. So that's why for those discipline libraries, and that's kind of why we split it up that way. You know, the mechanical library, you know, as BIM managers, we obviously still have administrative rights to that, but so does our, you know, mechanical discipline lead. So that way he has the ability to go in and kind of curate that content as he needs to. And we obviously work closely with him and the other discipline leads to make sure that it's complying with any company standard that we have.
Right. So these discipline leads is there one discipline lead per discipline, and then they sort of will gather feedback from their entire national group?
Yeah, I would say so. It's usually 1 to 2 per discipline, and you're right. They work closely, obviously, with their own circles for the different engineering disciplines, and you know, get feedback from them, what's working, what's not on a project, and then they can take it from there.
All right. So what about software? So when it comes to library management and software, it must have taken a while to choose the right content management system. And so how critical of a role does the right software for content management play in keeping your libraries organized?
I've found that it's extremely critical. You know, when I was at FKP prior to the merger, we had actually rolled out Unify to the firm. And that was my way of helping myself manage that content, because at the time I was only a part-time BIM manager, as I'm sure some folks on the call might be, but you know, I was still an architect and doing project work, but I was also in charge of our company standards and content and all that stuff. And so Unify was a really good way of not only just letting me see what content we had, but being able to really organizing it in a meaningful way, and just taking advantage of things that we couldn't do on our own network.
Right. So was it difficult to, you know, quote unquote, prove to your higher ups that a content management system was needed within your firm? Or like, did you have to calculate an ROI, or what was that process like?
Yeah, there's always some sort of, you know, presentation that needs to happen to kind of prove, you know, the proof of concept, so to speak, and that ROI, like you mentioned. But you know, we didn't really run into resistance with, you know, leadership just understanding that yes, we did need something in place. You know, when it came down to what specifically that was, obviously there's a big, you know, analysis that had been done about, you know, the different software and tools that were out there, and you know, features based on how we work, and you know, where's the most overlap.
Okay. All right, so we've talked a lot about libraries at FKP, permissions, roles. Now let's drill down and start to talk about the content within those libraries. So when it comes to developing content, there are lots of means and methods, there are best practices, BIM standards, guidelines. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those standards that you've implemented? If we could start with,
Sure.
let's say, data sets, or, you know, level of detail, things of that nature.
Yeah, level of detail can be hard. But yeah, we don't have any like true hard and fast, like you must follow all these things in order for a piece of content to be accepted into a library. But we do have obviously a large amount of just kind of company standard content. And we, you know, it's a constant development process with that content as it keeps getting used. And we hear from teams about, man, I wish, you know, this piece of content did this or that, or something that it doesn't do right now. That's really the clear and best way for us to really know how effective that content is out on the floor, so to speak. So we're always open to that kind of suggestion workflow. But you know, when we really look at content, we want it to be as concise and you know, as concise and not overly detailed as possible. You know, at least from the architecture point of view, because a lot of times we work in like a basis of design environment, and you know, specifications will feed out to contractors, and they'll end up picking something that we didn't populate the model with anyway. So that's kind of our standard, is that we don't want to over detail it, but at the same time, we want something that represents what we're trying to use.
Right. So you mentioned, specs going out to contractors. So do you also have sort of a rule that the information should only really live in one place? Like if you had mentioned not having too much detail in the families from, I guess, a geometry perspective, but what about from a data perspective? Do you put as much data in there as possible to align with the specs, or do you sort of kind of point the contractors to the specs rather than the model? Because I realize a lot of firms have these sort of statements, with kind of like a release of liability, like do not look at the data within the models. Is that the case at FKP?
Yeah, that's a holdover, right? That we as an industry have spent a lot of time delivering work in the same way for so long that trying to turn that train on a dime has been really difficult.
Right.
So from a legal perspective, yeah, we always want to say that, right? Like our deliverables are the PDF documents. You can look at the model, but you can't rely on anything in that model. We're starting to get away from that, with the curation of our BIM execution plans and LOD matrix and a lot of those kind of VDC sessions that we like to have with our clients and trade partners, because then we can really start introducing that kind of terminology with them. Like, all right, for doors, partitions and doors and casework, like, geometrically and location-wise, that should be accurate in the model. And we're starting to get more into that. But it's still a tough uphill battle to just fully hand over a model as a deliverable, which I think is the end goal, but we're just not there yet.
Right. I think as an industry, it will be a while before we get there. So aside from the content that your firm develops internally, there are some mixed feelings about industry, mixed feelings throughout the industry about manufacturer content or even third-party content in general. Do you have at FKP? Do you have any hard and fast rules for only using internal content?
No, we don't. Manufacturer content, there are pros and cons, right? I mean, I think we all have experience with it, and we've experienced those families from certain manufacturers where, the nuts are detailed and you can see threads and stuff, and that's just goofy. But at the same time, there's a lot of really good stuff out there. And I'm actually going to go back to kind of what I said earlier about designing from like a basis of design standpoint. And I encourage teams a lot of times, like if you want something in the project that's a very specific thing, and there's content that lives out there for that thing, we should really take a look at that and see if we can just put that in the model. Because, too many times I've seen we run into coordination issues during construction where something just doesn't fit right, and it's because we used some generic placeholder because we didn't model the thing correctly or didn't have the right information tied to it. And with manufacturing content helps solve that problem sometimes, but like I said, you have to really review that content before you just load it into your model.
Right. So what about demand for content internally? Like let's say, sometimes firms will have a staff dedicated to developing content, or maybe there are some power users that can build BIM content over other folks who are less experienced. So do you have a team structure, or what's your team structure like in terms of developing content? Is there a dedicated department for that?
Yeah, good question. The short answer is no, we don't have a dedicated department for that. We kind of piecemeal it between our BIM managers and also kind of how you mentioned BIM specialists, like power users, essentially. Being such a large firm, there's such a wide array of expertise in a company that, there are going to be people that know how to build good, intelligent content out there. So we want to be able to leverage that, and we encourage people to do that if they know what they're doing. But I'll also go a little more high level on that, and it's not always an issue of needing to build content so much as what I found, like having our users know where to find content. We have a lot of content at CannonDesign, And I think part of the struggle with people like submitting requests for I need this family or that family or this thing, 99% of the time I can just point them to the location where it already lives. And so that was one of the main reasons that we wanted to go to like a different content management system with more powerful search features than just trying to use Windows Explorer. Because a lot of times people just wouldn't take the time to find something, or it'd be in like the 20th subfolder of a tree, and that no one would ever get to. So being able to search more effectively for content, I think, has actually really cut down on the need for like content requests and building new content all the time.
Sure, and can you elaborate a little bit on how, like, what sorts of search functionality do you see being used most often at your firm? Like, let's say tagging, for example. You had mentioned using tags as opposed to having a separate library for subdisciplines. Do you have, like, let's say you have an engineering arm you'd mentioned, so do you break out tags into, say, like audio visual or technology, which is, a sub under, let's say, electrical engineering, or even architecture? You could take like maybe interiors. Are tags structured that way, or can you tell us a little bit about how you've decided to structure your tags?
Yeah, they are structured that way, and we also have that content still living in separate libraries as well, just because sometimes it's easier for someone to see that on a visual interface rather than just having all content in a single bucket. Even though it would work that way, we don't always see as many people as we'd like leveraging tags in the way they're meant to be used. So by still having a bucket called mechanical, that at least gives someone a start. And then within that, they can search for, ducts or, air handlers or something like that. So that first kind of launching point has really helped a lot of people understand how that stuff is structured.
Okay, so what about, you had mentioned your designers are typically the ones who develop content on the fly while they're on projects. Now, what about when they decide they want to roll that out to the firm? And earlier, again, you mentioned the Sandbox Library. Is the process, they just dump it into the Sandbox Library and then the BIM managers will review, or how does that work at FKP Cannon?
It depends. The Sandbox Library is definitely one way of doing that. I've been mentioning Unify, so those familiar with it know like there's a built-in upload feature. So we may just get people uploading content, and they say, hey, this is a great family, and it should be in this this company library, whether that's architecture or mechanical or interiors or what have you. So we also get a lot of good content that way. And sometimes it's just a phone call to me or one of my colleagues, and it's like, hey, we have all this good content that we developed for this one project, but we'd like you to take a look at it and see if it's something that we can use firm-wide. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't.
Right. So that being said, I realize it must be impossible to, keep as close of an eye on the content that gets loaded into Revit models. How do you go about keeping an eye on the content that's loaded into these projects? Do you do a manual process, or do you have some applications that you use?
It's a combined approach. I would think that the first and foremost kind of boots on the ground method is that we like to assign a model manager to every project once it starts. So that's someone that is obviously part of that project team, but maybe a power user of Revit, so they understand what they're doing. And they're intimately involved. So that way they can really keep an eye on how the model is being developed and what content's being loaded in. That doesn't always work. And depending on the kind of the cross-section of that project team, you may have someone who's of the mind that they're one of those people that have been copying content from project to project for 10 years. So that can happen, and sometimes the model manager might not be aware of it. And in that case, we do leverage a couple different utilities to really investigate that behavior. And one of those is the Unify project analytics tool. That really helps us see what's getting loaded into a certain project. And we're also making some strategic partnerships with other companies to really help us audit project models, not just for content, but for other information as well.
Oh, that's great that you're using Project Analytics. We literally rolled that out last month. So a lot of folks are pretty excited about that. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience? I actually would like to hear it from your end, your experience on Project Analytics in terms of being the ability to view content within these models. If you could just touch on some specific features that help leverage that.
Yeah, the project analytics has been a real game changer for us because, and I think we're not alone in this struggle of like, there's one struggle of getting a model set up correctly and establishing coordinates and making sure kind of project setup standards are being followed. But then once that project's in flight, it becomes a real struggle to make sure it's not getting weighed down, every day by just things getting loaded in, and purging stuff can help, but when a model breaks, or when you get those error messages and people can't save and you're getting frantic calls in the middle of the night and you're wondering what happened, it's a very reactive approach, as opposed to being proactive about being able to really monitor what's going in there. So Unify Project Analytics has allowed us to set thresholds for certain things like Revit links and CAD imports and images and all these things that, once you get to a certain point, you say like, that's enough. There's too much of this in this project file. You're going to be seeing trouble down the road. And that's really what helps us maintain a proactive look before the issue happens, before we get that phone call, to really say, hey, let's meet and talk about how to fix this.
All right, that's great. All right, well, that actually concludes my segment for today's episode. But before we move into the Q&A, I'd like to hand the floor to you and see if you have any additional advice just for any of the multidisciplinary BIM managers out there.
Sure, yeah. So, my experience in a multidisciplinary firm has been pretty unique, just because I kind of got here through a merger and I've been learning a lot. But one of my most important rules, regardless of how many disciplines you're involved in, is listening is the most important part of the job. My role at this company exists because people need help, and I can't provide them assistance unless I'm truly listening to what the problem is. So by far, like sitting down with teams and people and hearing about their struggles and being part of those struggles myself, in my former architect life, has really helped, kind of clear my focus on what are the real issues in the way we deliver work. Secondly, like the amount of content, at least for us, is not the issue. It's just about having curated, concise content that works for everybody. And I think that's one of the main streamliners that really helps us, is that we don't want, 6 different light fixtures that are the exact same thing. We want one that works for everybody as much as we can, as often as we can. And just being as, holistic as possible in that approach and providing easy workflows for users will get you places quickly.
All right, well, thank you for that. That's great advice. All right, so with all that being said, I'll go ahead and hand the floor back over to Laura, and she will handle our Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Adam and Jay, for that outstanding and very insightful discussion. We'll go ahead and get into our audience questions at this time. And once again, I mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar, but please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit any questions you have. These can be directly related to some presentation or about managing Revit libraries in multidisciplinary firms in general. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first question we have is, anyone can create content, but all the content is passed to a BIM manager. I'm sorry, there's a typo here.
Analyze, I believe it's a...
To analyze if it can become part of the standard library. And let me repeat that, I'm so sorry. So anyone can create content, but all the content is passed to the BIM manager to analyze if it can become part of the standard library.
Yeah, and to repeat kind of that process that Jay and I talked about earlier about that workflow for like submitting content, it's not just coming to me as a BIM manager. If there's something that is being proposed to become part of the library, we really want to take a look at not only what discipline is it coming from? Because oftentimes we'll need to pull in that discipline lead, but also we pull in quality. Quality doesn't always know the ins and outs of Revit, but they understand project delivery probably better than we do. So we always work with them really closely to see like how are we embedding information, how is this being presented on a sheet in a drawing set, and so we work pretty closely with them. And before all of that, it really gives us a stopgap to say, is this duplicative of something we already have in our company library? Because we get those all the time too. And again, that goes back to not being able to find content correctly and search functions and all that stuff.
Okay, great. And a follow-up to that is there a checklist of parameters, data, etc., that a family should have, for example?
Yes. And that's something that we're still working on as a company. We try and build as much of that into our family templates as we can. That there should be like object styles and parameters built into those that are associated with those types of content. I don't think we're there yet, but we're getting there. And that's kind of the pie in the sky hope that when someone goes to create that piece of content, parameters should already live there ready for them to use.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Our next question is there a model manager per discipline?
So I'm assuming model manager per discipline per project. The hope would be yes. We will have multiple teams and multiple Revit files for every project that we're a part of. So if we have a full set of architecture and MEP models, yes, we would hope that there would be a model manager for each of those disciplines, focusing on their own project files.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, do you know of an easy way to merge several shared parameter files?
Easy, I don't know. There are some tools out there that can do that. I don't know if there are any free ones, but there are ways to do that.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, how do you manage shared parameters for Revit families where data is cross-discipline?
Oh, that's a great question. And this is something that we're actively working on here at CannonDesign. We did an audit on our own network a couple months ago and discovered we had way too many shared parameter files floating around. So that's something that we are actively working on to kind of condense. And I think our approach to that is to have kind of that master shared parameter file. And that goes back to content too, right? The whole like have one light fixture, not 6. We want to have one shared parameter that's called, width and not 20 of them. So.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, Adam, what compelled you to get into the BIM side of the industry?
Honestly, I'm just a geek. So, technology has always been a big part of what I do. And when I was in undergraduate school, I got kind of my first taste of Revit there. And even though the half a semester I got was pretty dull and mind-numbing, Revit really excited me. And so I really took on the challenge of like learning that in design studios in architecture, which it was a challenge. And it really just took off for me from there. Like it's been a passion of mine since then.
If I could have a follow-up question to that one, were you an AutoCAD user or other CAD software user prior to Revit?
Professionally, I've worked in other softwares just outside of like the Autodesk ecosystem. So it was kind of weird. Like my first professional work, I used a Bentley MicroStation, which was just odd, compared to what Revit can do. But no, I didn't work a lot in AutoCAD prior to my experience in Revit. I had about a similar level of training in school on AutoCAD, so I know the ins and outs. I know what to do. I just prefer Revit.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question, do you do anything to enforce your BIM standards?
We do, and things like the model analytics tool and having model managers kind of monitoring things helps us do that. We're not the police by any means. We're not gonna slap your hand if you do something, but we will kind of notice trends, and if we notice that, things are getting loaded in that shouldn't be in there, or people are exploding CAD files on a project, really that tells me that there's just an opportunity for training. Because a lot of times, we all understand being on a deadline and doing what you need to do to get something done, and teams feel victorious about that when they can meet the deadline. But if it's at the cost of model performance, and you're moving further down the road and no one can open the file, it just hurts everybody. So I always like to kind of remind teams of that, the garbage in, garbage out type mantra.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, kind of related to that, what are your thoughts on government mandated BIM standards?
Those are necessary at times. We do government work here, and those are just mandates. Like we have to abide by them. So we try and come up with workflows that can match those. There are certain, they may adopt the national CAD standards for, life safety is kind of one that I know of, and so our typical kind of life safety workflows and identifications on drawings need to be changed for that particular project because it needs to be done in a certain way. And that's just one of those things that, that's the exception and not the rule. So 95% of the time we can do what we do and, be really efficient about it. And that other 5% of the time, yeah, that would be when, we may need to step in with a team and give them, a quick training on, all right, this is how you're going to do it for this project.
Gotcha. Thank you. Our next question, how do you use families versions?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, of course. So how do you manage the families versions?
Oh, good question. Historically, we always had kind of the library structure copied over and upgraded from version to version. Unify has helped us get rid of that because on their cloud system, it just upgrades all the content automatically to the latest version of Revit. So that's kind of been another saving grace of saving us space on our network of not having these duplicative folders of all the same content. It lives in a cloud environment, and you'll only pull in the version year that you need for whatever project you have open.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Next question. How long did it take to implement Unify across your firm, and what team members were required to test it out during the free trial?
Good question. So it took quite a bit, but the advantage was that we got to start small with the 3 FKP offices, and so that was kind of like the testing bed once we merged with CannonDesign. The actual integration of it's pretty easy, but it's more about addressing the user concern and their need and desire to just keep doing what they've been doing, but we need to teach them that there's like a new efficient way to do that. So I think training was the biggest part of that implementation, because technically speaking, like rolling out the software is not that big a deal. But teaching people where to go, how to search, how to use saved searches, how to search for tags, that all just takes time, and it takes time with them using it too. So, doing the rollout training is one thing, and then fielding questions from offices for the next, couple months is another. So it's just one of those hurdles, but, once people use it and get over those obstacles, that's when you really start seeing that ROI generation.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, how many BIM managers are there at a big company like CannonDesign?
Good question. So we have 4 BIM managers, and they're kind of separated up regionally. 4 may sound small, so I don't know, we have just over 1,000 employees, so whatever that ratio is, yeah. But we're all very passionate about it. We all understand a lot. We're all very active with every discipline across the firm, so it helps us really be light on our feet. And we work really effectively together to address the needs of the firm, individual project teams, or even individuals who may need training. We're all just super passionate about it and happy to help.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question is, do you have an actual real life example of a situation where using Sandbox helped you out?
Good question. There's a couple, but one of the ones that I'm thinking of is kind of mundane, but like for an electrical family we had, someone had taken our horizontal raceway family and just made a vertical version of that, and they put that in the Sandbox Library. And no one was sure it was there until someone started searching for this raceway that they needed, and they found out it was in the Sandbox Library. So it's kind of a everyday example, but it was something that someone just took at liberty of their own time and desire to do to develop a piece of content that then later became a need of somebody else. And that's how we really see that growing and happening. Like it's that playground, it's that, hey, let's go try something and put it in here. And as long as people are searching in that location for content, they might be able to find what they're looking for.
Okay, wonderful. And it looks like that wraps up the Q&A portion of our webinar. So thank you so much to our audience for asking those questions, and of course to Adam to answering those and being so willing to provide your insight. Thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to join us today. We will be sending out this webinar later on for you to reference and share with us if you're interested. With this, we will include a link to a survey for your feedback. We want to ensure these webinars are worth your time and that we are covering topics that you find relevant and useful. So we would sincerely appreciate if you took a few minutes to fill out that survey and let us know how we're doing. Again, a huge thank you to Adam Murray for joining us today and sharing useful insight. We sincerely appreciate everyone's time, and we hope you enjoy the day. Thanks so much.